Welcome to the 60th A.W. Mellon Lectures in the Fine Arts. In this six-part lecture series, entitled The 12 Caesars, Images of Power from Ancient Rome to Salvador Dali, Professor Mary Beard of Cambridge University examines the continuing engagement throughout history with images of Roman emperors and its impact on Western visual art and culture. In this sixth and final lecture of the series, entitled Rough Work, Emperors Defaced and Destroyed, originally delivered at the National Gallery of Art on May 8, 2011, the distinguished classicist and professor Mary Beard summarizes the complexity of the reception of images of Roman imperial life and power as they have been altered, combined, redefined, and proliferated in all media.
Right, we've got to the end. I'm extremely sad, actually, that this is the last lecture I'll be giving. I mean, I can see that 6 is enough, and I don't think that I've got any more to say, but I'm still sad it's coming to an end. And at this point, I would really like to thank you all for coming and being here. I think it's been a great tribute to the Romans in Washington that so many people turned up. And of course, I'd like to thank CASVA and the National Gallery for being the best of all hosts while I've been here. You'll probably have guessed, because I keep changing my mind about what's going to be in the lectures from time to time, that I've been writing them here one by one. And I have to say that the reason that they've taken the form that they have and the things that they've talked about is in very large part thanks to the resources here, the community, and the great fun I've had since I arrived. So I'd like to thank everybody from the deans and the fellows and the staff at CASVA, the librarians, the various curators and heads of programs and other staff in the gallery, and the technical wizard of the PowerPoint and recording departments. Thank you. Thank you all. So I'm going to start today by reminding you where we began almost 2 months ago now, with this sarcophagus, which for years stood outside the Arts and Industries building on the Mall. Picked up in the late 1830s by Jesse Elliott on the USS Constitution, it was believed, almost certainly wrongly, to have been the original resting place of the 3rd century AD Roman Emperor Alexander Severus. It was, as we saw, offered to the elderly Andrew Jackson for his own burial, but he, in the letter quoted on the handout you had in line, rejected it very firmly. "I cannot consent," he wrote, "that my mortal body should be laid in a repository prepared for an emperor or king. My republican feelings and principles forbid it. The simplicity of our system of government forbids it." And so, surplus to requirements, it ended up on display in the Mall until the mid-1980s. And at the end of this lecture, we will, I promise you, visit it in its present home. But that will be after we have thought more generally about questions of rejecting or destroying emperors and their images, about smashing statues, defacing them, or otherwise disposing of them, writing them off. And I shall be thinking about those questions both in antiquity and in the modern world right up to today. And I should be suggesting that both then and now we're dealing with a much more complicated series of trade-offs between remembering emperors and forgetting them, much more complicated than we imagine. In short, destruction, we will find, is not necessarily obliteration. Destruction, we will discover, is also a different form of remembering. But to balance Andrew Jackson's rejected sarcophagus, I shall also be keeping in the back of my mind this very different image of Roman imperial life and power. This is Franklin D. Roosevelt's birthday party in 1934, and you will see that it was a toga party. FDR here is flanked by his wife and daughter, Eleanor supposedly in the costume of the Delphic Oracle, and Anna as a Vestal Virgin, so it was said. Now, there are various views about what prompted this style of celebration. One is, of course, that it was all Eleanor's idea, dressing FDR up as an emperor as a kind of parody of the accusations levelled at him, just as they'd been levelled at Andrew Jackson, that he was behaving like a Caesar. It was then an attempt, at least in private, to ridicule the very accusations that it appears to act out. But even if that is the case, it's hard at first sight not to see this also as a kind of trivialization of the image of the Roman emperor and empire. If it's a way of rejecting accusations of autocracy, then it's a much less dignified way than Andrew Jackson's. And so it raises other questions that I'll be looking at this afternoon. Have we ceased to be able to take Roman emperors seriously? Is this how we now destroy them? But let's start in antiquity itself, where there was a powerful tradition of defacing imperial statues, of leaving the marks of dissent, opposition, and conflict on the body of the emperor in sculpture. Just as imperial statues could be thought of to contain the power of the emperor, and I mentioned a few weeks ago, for example, that a runaway slave could take refuge from his master by clinging to the emperor's statue. It was seen to be that powerful. Just as they could be, as it were, vested with imperial power, so statues could also become the stand-in victims of violence against the emperor, both within the empire itself and outside it. Rome's enemies not only took delight in parading the submission of the Roman autocrat in their own works of art, as we saw in these Sasanian reliefs from Iran a few weeks ago. If they got a chance, they would wreak their vengeance on the Roman images of the emperor that blazoned imperial power across the Roman world. Now, it's not always easy now to identify evidence of this kind of destruction. I think intentional destruction is one of the very hardest things to track archaeologically. That's to say, you can see that something's broken, but it's very hard to know if it was deliberately smashed up or whether it just fell to pieces. But many people now think that this bronze head, for example, that was dragged out of a river in eastern England in 1907, is actually a head of the Emperor Claudius, decapitated, it's argued, by the British rebel Boadicea in the 60s AD and thrown into the river. Now, maybe, maybe not. Who knows? It's anybody's guess. There is, though, one very, very striking case where we can be almost 100% certain that the remains of a statue we have has been a victim of insurgency. And it's one of the most famous images of the Emperor Augustus that there is, and one whose hairstyle we have had the pleasure of examining several times over the last few weeks. It's usually called the Meroe head because it was found in northern Sudan at the site of Meroe, an ancient city of the Kushite Empire and a long-standing enemy of Rome along the Roman Empire's southern margins in Africa. And you see on the screen now some of the famous Meroitic pyramids from this site. This is what the site of the town itself actually looks like now. But that's only part of the story of the find spot, because the head was actually found buried here under the entrance steps of this little Kushite temple of victory. This is found just under here, in fact, the bottom right. Which is to say that every time these people walked up their victory steps, they were, in a sense, trampling on the decapitated head of a Roman emperor. Now, almost certainly, the Kushites had got this head as a trophy in one of their raids north into firm Roman territory. And in fact, one Roman writer refers to statues of Augustus erected near the first cataract of the Nile, modern Aswan, statues that were destroyed and hauled off in Kushite raids in 25 BC. And almost certainly that bronze head is a remnant of one of those Kushite raids into Roman territory. Now, there is, of course, an irony here. The Kushites got their trophy, and no doubt they took immense pleasure in pounding up the steps of their temple, knowing that they were pounding over the decapitated head in bronze of the Roman emperor. But in the long run, that was exactly what preserved it, so that now it is one of the most studied, most copied, and most famous of all imperial heads. Couldn't resist showing this one on the screen. Is a Sudanese friend of mine eyeing a replica of the Meroe head, rather slightly suspiciously, in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. So, in the perspective of a couple of millennia, the enemy Kushites actually achieved for the statue the prominence, fame, and longevity that they thought they'd put a stop to. Now, that's the kind of irony that you sometimes find elsewhere and within the Roman Empire too. If you came to the lecture on the Agrippinas a few weeks ago, you remember that I showed this slightly puzzling bit of relief sculpture with Nero being crowned by, well, we weren't certain whether it was his mum or whether it was a goddess. What I didn't say then is that one of the reasons that the detail on this relief is still so clear is that sometime after the overthrow of Nero, the people of Aphrodisias decided that they did not any longer want to display the unacceptable face of the old dynasty, so they removed it from their bright, shiny portico, and they reused it face down as a paving slab. So by walking on it, they actually preserved it. That's just one of the ways that, in a sense, destruction is never quite destruction. And destruction almost always has a different form of preservation entailed in it. But it also raises the much bigger question of what is known in Latin as damnatio memoriae, or in English, difficult to translate, the damnation of memory. Now, you'll read in many, and I suspect most, modern accounts that when an unpopular Roman emperor was overthrown, when there was a major regime change, the Senate might, if it wished, pass a decree of damnatio memoriae to destroy the emperor's images and even to remove his name from inscribed public documents. The idea, it said, was the eradication of the hated emperor from visual memory, whether his images ended up as paving stones or in a river or smashed up, or in the case of metal statues and coins, melted down. And this practice of damnatio memoriae is commonly seen, in fact, as the template for many forms of later political iconoclasm right up to the present day, as we've seen recently with the toppling of Saddam Hussein, although we know now that this was a rather stage-managed bit of iconoclasm, or more recently with the removal of the posters of Mubarak in Egypt. And that's, I suppose, the standard story about destroying the emperor's memory. But actually it's not right, I think, and the position here is not quite so simple. And indeed, the whole idea of damnatio memoriae is misleading in a number of important ways. Because, as the Princeton historian Harriet Flower has recently shown, there was actually no such thing as a decree of damnatio memoriae. That's an invention of modern scholarship. And although it is now quite a well-known phrase in Latin, and it's a well enough known phrase to have its own Wikipedia entry, which is not many Latin phrases get, despite it being a well-known phrase in Latin, there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that it was ever used by the Romans. That is to say, no surviving Latin anywhere includes the phrase damnatio memoriae. Now, I stress that because many people working in later periods of visual culture take it for granted that this was a common ancient Roman term, when it certainly isn't. It's a bit of modern invented Latin. Nor was there any such thing, whatever it might have been called, as a blanket decree to condemn any emperor's memory at a stroke. It is true that there were piecemeal decrees. The Senate, for example, voted to melt down the coinage of Caligula after his death. It's not quite clear how they thought they would manage to put that into practice, but they certainly voted it. And there were also all kinds of attacks on images, which ranged from some semi-spontaneous ones to some highly and carefully orchestrated ones. We read, for example, of the Emperor Domitian's statues being dismembered, quotes, as if blood and pain would follow every blow to them. And there's one really extraordinary, and I would imagine fictional, later story of a painting of at least an imperial pretender being stuck on a cross and, as it were, crucified. The painting is crucified. And even more common must have been the careful strategic removal of certain images from public view. You're not going to be so stupid. If the old emperor has just been assassinated and a new regime has taken place, you probably sensibly remove some of your public images of the old guard from display. And then, in fact, in 69 AD, the year of the 4 emperors after the fall of the Emperor Nero, Suetonius tells us that Otho, who was a friend of Nero and the short-lived emperor who came between the short-lived Galba and the equally short-lived Vitellius, that Otho had Nero's statues, Suetonius says, put back up again, which implies that there are a good few that had been kind of stuffed away in a store cupboard or a basement, but were ready and waiting there to be put up if the mood changed. So all that is true. There were destruction of Roman images aplenty, but there was never a single systematic blanket decree to eradicate images and to eradicate memory. And anyway, and Harriet Flower has also been very good on this. Anyway, the aim of the kind of defacement that took place can't simply have been to eradicate the emperor's memory from the collective consciousness. It wasn't to promote amnesia. It was more to change the way the emperor was remembered. Now, take this pair of public inscriptions in which the name of an emperor who subsequently fell from grace, a subsequently hated emperor, has been chiselled out. You can see on the left-hand side, where's my arrow? Lost me. There. You can see the top line, you've chiselled out part of the name, third line, and down here, and on the right-hand side in the middle, a great gash along the centre. Now, I think you only have to look at these pictures and to look at the very visible and striking gashes in the stone to see that this cannot be a way of forgetting the hated emperor. It was rather a way of remembering that they were hated, and if you like, it's a Roman way of remembering to forget them. So it's a much more complicated balance between forgetfulness and memory. If you want to forget this guy, you just remove the whole stone. You don't go away and make a nasty gash in these rather nice inscriptions. Now that comes over very clearly in written texts like this, but you see something very similar in painting and sculpture, where the glaring gap that is left once somebody's portrait has been hacked out is what speaks to you. You can see here his gaiter has gone, and you sort of see him there's his clothes, and someone has just smeared a lot of stuff over his face. And here, this was gaiter too, and now we've got what had been a nice pair of guys between an altar. We've just got a gash down the left-hand side, and the other bloke still standing there. Now, the point about this, unless the Romans were really stupid, the function cannot have been to conceal the abomination of these people. It must have been quite the reverse. It is really an attempt to remember, and in a sense a successful attempt really, to immortalise the rejection of the imperial person, who is very visibly and permanently and obviously expunged. Now, something similar may be going on in the way imperial portraits were reworked and re-identified and re-signified. Now, sometimes this was a way, as we've seen, of establishing genealogy. You know, when Julius Caesar puts his own head onto a statue of Alexander the Great, he's in a sense putting himself in the lineage of Alexander the Great. But on other occasions, there are other messages. This sculpture, said to be of Germanicus, who was the husband of the good Agrippina, was at some point in its history, I think not so much defaced, though it was that, but it was turned into a permanent commemoration of Christianity's victory over pagan imperial power. One of the most memorable examples of this actually is the story of what happened to the famous bronze statue of the Emperor Nero, the so-called Colossus, which was, according to Suetonius, over 100 foot high, that stood once at the entranceway to Nero's vast palace in the centre of Rome, the so-called Golden House. Now, sadly, this statue no longer survives, or I'm afraid if you look at these attempted reconstructions of it, you might be pleased that it no longer survives. They're all equally ghastly, particularly the version on the San Marino stamp. But the point I want to make is that we know from the way this statue is described that when Nero was overthrown, this great bronze image was not melted down. That would have been the way of getting rid of it. But it went through a series of transformations and adjustments. Vespasian, who you remember was the down-to-earth founder of the next imperial dynasty, left Nero's statue in place, but is supposed to have changed its features to turn it into the statue of the sun god. The Emperor Hadrian later moved it a little distance to make room for some building schemes of his own and claimed that it took 24 elephants to shift it. And then later, the Emperor Commodus, who, if you've seen the movie Gladiator, was the villain of the movie Gladiator, changed the statue again, this time into a likeness of himself, but also carrying the distinctive club and the lion skin worn by Hercules, his patron god. After the fall of Commodus, the statue was apparently turned back into the sun god again. And what you have here, in other words, I think, is a complex visual dialogue going on, in which Nero is not forgotten. I'm sure Nero is not forgotten in this. What we're remembering all the time, when we're dealing with this statue and moving it and altering it and transforming it, is that this always remained the statue that once had been Nero. And it's a dialogue which, in a funny way, we're almost ourselves apart, because before it was destroyed, and that was, let's guess, in the early Middle Ages, the colossal statue had actually given its name to the Colosseum next to which it stood. Although I suspect most modern visitors to the Colosseum think it's called the Colosseum because it is colossal, Actually, it was called the Colosseum because there was a colossal statue of Nero standing next to it. So Nero's Colossus remains buried in that kind of popular consciousness. But the key point I'm trying to make here is that the line drawn in the Roman world between the destruction and preservation of images of emperors, between remembering them and forgetting them, is a trickier and fuzzier one than we often imagine. Destruction, in fact, or partial destruction, in some circumstances and in some forms, was a very, very powerful strategy of memorialization. It wasn't always, and it certainly wasn't necessarily, about forgetting. Now, I want you to keep some of those ambiguities about memory and forgetfulness in mind when we come to reflect now on our own contemporary engagement with memories of, and possibly rejection of, Roman emperors and the images of Roman imperial power. Now, throughout this series of lectures, I've stressed the idea that as cultural artefacts, Roman emperors were very much works in progress, in a variety of different ways, and some of them stretching right back to the ancient world itself, some of them much more in the hands of the Renaissance and later. We have seen ancient imperial statues altered, adjusted, and redefined. And we've seen canonical images of Roman emperors made and remade and proliferated by the thousand through all kinds of media. Yesterday morning, in fact, as I left my apartment and thought I'd take a trip to the auctioneers next door just before I came into the office, I found another Roman emperor. He's got his back to the FBI building. Because I came face to face with this rather nice mid-19th century Italian Augustus, who will be going under the hammer next Saturday morning. So they're everywhere, and you find them all the time. As soon as you learn to spot them, every sale has got a Roman emperor in it. We've also seen a sometimes exciting and sometimes baffling process of the construction of imperial identity, as long-known antiquities, new discoveries, fakes, copies, literary accounts, modern paintings, prints, and movies all contribute to creating for us a recognizable image of Julius Caesar or Augustus or whoever. Why, for example, does this wonderful piece of sculpture look to us like Caesar? Or why does that cartoon look like Caesar? Well, very largely because, since the Renaissance, the combined efforts of artists and archaeologists, antiquarians and art historians have got together to make that the recognizable image of Caesar for us. And of course, we've seen identifications and re-identifications being debated, mistaken, contested, and rewritten in a long tradition of change that testifies both to the malleability of these imperial images, but also to them still mattering, them continuing to be, in the old cliche, good to think with. Roman emperors, long time, remained very good to think with. There is, however, a nasty, nagging question that we must finally address, and that is, do they really still matter in 2011? Are these emperors still part of a living, visual, and symbolic culture? Are they still work in progress? Or has this cast of Roman imperial characters finally gone? Or is it going from our collective memories? Now, there's one rather gloomy answer to that question, and a narrative that I think many of us would be able to tell that would point to the slow death of the Roman emperor as a living symbol. And I'll give you a version of what this narrative might look like, sound like. It goes like this. It's all in inverted commas. Not only, it would say, does the classical tradition in general no longer speak to a wide Western constituency, but the idea and image of the Roman emperor has been dramatically decentered, a decentering that probably happened in the 20th century, when, despite, or possibly because of, the efforts of Mussolini and his like, who plastered lookalike images of the Caesars across the towns of Italy and elsewhere, we witnessed the trivialization and commercialization of the imperial images. Where emperors have ended up now is on boxer shorts. There you can see, it says, if you can't quite read it, it says, make like Nero in Quo Vadis shorts, right? On tins of sardines. Here's hot Titus, a delicacy to which I've been introduced only here. In cartoons, or as the cardboard cut-out villains of Hollywood movies. That's a nice little trio of Neros. This, the story would go, is a far cry from the emperor's previous role on the best silverware, on lavish jewels, and in the most glorious and rich halls of Europe and the United States, created and recreated by the greatest artists. That is no longer how it is. Or to put it another way, where the great and the good between the 15th and 19th century were seriously portrayed as Roman emperors. There's a wonderful George II from my university library in Cambridge. Now, if you cast a leading politician, we're being even-handed here, as an emperor, it is always for ridicule. Why we laugh at FDR's toga party is actually because being a Roman emperor can't be serious any longer. That's a narrative. I'm going to explore in a little while that theme about whether we can dress up as Romans still, because I think that adds an interesting complexity to this story. But for now, I suppose I'm going to admit that although it hurts me to say it, I think that there is a grain of truth in that rather gloomy narrative, the narrative of the decline of Roman imperial power in Western culture, but only a very small grain. It's mostly wrong, not entirely. Why is it wrong? Well, I've tried to show over the last few weeks that images of emperors are still a key part of the modern artistic repertoire. We glimpse Rudi Pozzati's emperors from here in the National Gallery, and in the title of the series, I alluded to Salvador Dali, who repeatedly returned to images of the 2nd century AD Emperor Trajan. A return that was partly prompted by the fact that Trajan, like Dali, came from Spain. And here's two versions of Trajan on horseback. I have to say that rather worryingly, and possibly a marker of decline, is that in several modern popular accounts of Dali's work, these Trajans on horseback often appear as a Trojan on horseback, which was certainly not what they were originally called, although Dali did also create a number of versions of the Trojan horse. This is Trajan, the emperor, not a Trojan. But anyway, even those trivializing images in cartoons and commerce of Roman emperors that we've seen still depend on those figures being culturally recognizable. There's no point in calling your sardines hot Titus unless that still resonates in some way. And Titus is a very odd choice, I have to say, actually. But I don't know why hot Titus. And there's no point in a cartoon satirizing a US president or a British prime minister as Nero fiddling while Rome burns if that incident also no longer resonates. And of course, it does still resonate. And it's a resonance that we can also detect in the razzmatazz that greets the discovery of potentially new imperial faces. In the first lecture, we looked at this portrait of Caesar, so-called, pulled out of the Rhone in 2008 by the underwater archaeologist who instantly shouted, "Mon Dieu, Jules César," right? A rather battered head that has already been the focus of its own TV documentary and special exhibition. But in January this year, just before I came to Washington, almost equal excitement greeted a peculiar discovery in Italy. As was reported all around the world, from India to Indiana, the Italian police caught some antiquities smugglers red-handed with what was said to be a newly discovered statue of the Emperor Caligula in the little town of Nemi in the hills outside Rome. And it was not just a newly discovered statue, but, so it was said, it came from the very tomb of the Emperor Caligula himself. Now, let me say straight away that this is an even more implausible identification than this Julius Caesar from the Rhone, and it's one that's made even more difficult to discuss by the fact that the police did not release any pictures of the statue, and so far as I know, still haven't released any pictures. But here's the twist. In the absence of any photographs to illustrate their articles, the papers were forced to turn to other images of Caligula. And I've just collected a few of the images that came from the newspaper reports. We've got a few assorted, possibly ancient Caligulas. We've got a still from the 1979 Gore Vidal Penthouse movie starring Malcolm McDowell as Caligula. We've got an engraving that we saw last week from Scamanossi's 12 Caesar series. But the favourite that they picked on was something else we looked at last time. They were always picking up various versions of Aegidius Sadler's engravings of Titian's Lost painting from his 11 Caesars series in Mantua. What I think is amazing is how when you put them together, how like the Sadler, Malcolm McDowell's, managed to be made to look, really. I think just collecting those, you could hardly hope for a more evocative symbol of the kind of multiple origins of our canonical images of these emperors. And here we have, in a sense, a nice symbol of the series. We're talking here about a statue that no one's ever seen, illustrated by a series of images that stretch over 2 millennia. That, in a sense, is the image of Caligula. So, in critiquing the simple narrative of decline, I think you could argue that although the forms and the genre and the interpretations of imperial images have changed a good deal, nevertheless, a good deal of the substance still remains. We're not even now, I think, living in an entirely post-imperial world. At the same time, if you want trivialised images of Roman emperors before the 20th century, you can certainly find them. So far, I have spared you any sight of this crude series of 18th century drawings put together by the self-styled Baron de Anquetil under the title of The Private Life of the 12 Caesars, which was a popular set of not very imaginative couplings, or sometimes triplings, as on the left. I've chosen two of the ones we can show in public here. This is Caligula and his 3 sisters. And I have to say, looking at that for some time, I've never quite worked out which one is Caligula. And over here, a very domestic and rather lovey-dovey scene of Agrippina in a carriage with her lover and son Nero. It's a kind of image of domesticity that is a far cry from the kind of magnificent, brooding, though uncomfortably voyeuristic images that we saw a few weeks ago of Nero with his mother's dead body. So I think although it's easy to point to modern, trivial, mass-produced commercial images of Roman emperors, you can find them easily in the 18th century and before. But I've also underlined on several occasions that long before the 20th century, images of emperors were much more edgy and much less taken for granted than we often imagine. It isn't simply a case of the dominance, the assumed dominance of Roman imperial emperors' imagery suddenly giving away to trivial or contested or satiric images. And a couple of weeks ago, we touched on some of the difficulties in debates that came to the surface when Canova used the so-called Agrippina statue as a model for his portrait of Napoleon's mother. Was she, as many people at the time in fact asked, was she meant to be the good elder Agrippina, or was she the bad younger Agrippina? And what did either of those identifications imply for the character of her son? For both Agrippinas had equally horrible children, one Caligula and the other Nero. Is that what Canova was implying about Napoleon? That he was as bad as Nero? Questions, all those questions. So I think we've got an edginess which particularly comes to the surface when we look at portrait sculpture. And I want now to explore this issue of portrait sculpture a little further, because I think it reveals better than most cases the sort of complexity of the changes in the way emperors impact on our own visual culture than many other things. And I want to suggest that it's not simply that we have ceased to find it meaningful seriously to display modern figures in Roman dress, although in a sense we have. You know, if we were to have a statue of Obama, we wouldn't think of putting him in a toga. But what that conceals is some much bigger representational shifts at stake. That something bigger has changed. It's not just that we don't any longer think that Roman dress is appropriate in portraiture. Now, in this, we'll also encounter some big issues about republicanism and empire, and that will neatly bring us back, of course, to Andrew Jackson and his sarcophagus. Okay, well, as we know, up to the beginning of the 20th century, the portraits of many modern figures showed them in togas, or in the hint of a toga, or in an elaborate imperial cuirass with a laurel wreath. What you see on screen here is an assortment of Medici's British monarchs and generals, and of course Andrew Jackson in a toga at the bottom left. Now, that practice of representing in public portraiture modern figures as Romans, and particularly as Roman emperors, died out, I think, at slightly different moments for slightly different types of sitters. Seems to me that clerics and academics retained the idea of the toga longer than politicians and soldiers did, and it may be no coincidence that the French word for academic dress is still la toge, or the toga, which in a sense builds up a link between Romanness and the formal academic portrait. But certainly, if any modern sculptor were to clad his sitter now in a toga, the result would be almost bound to look ludicrous to us, as I'm afraid this statue does. It's of the murdered anti-discrimination activist Alex O'Day, and it's done by the Algerian-American sculptor Khalil Bendib, and it is on display in Santa Ana, California. Bendib made quite a fuss about how he was representing Alex O'Day in a toga, so I emailed Bendib to ask him why he'd depicted the guy in Roman dress. He replied that as the Romans had used to rule so much of the Mediterranean for centuries, it seemed a natural way to portray a Christian Palestinian such as O'Day. I didn't see the logic of that. It seemed to be quite a nice thought, but it seemed certainly clear that it didn't speak to people in those terms. Right? But is it simply, so we've got it, there's a clear change here, but is it simply that we've rejected the Roman model for public display? And I don't think it is entirely. I think what has gone from modern culture. And as a shorthand, I'd say it probably went with modernism. What has gone is a particular range of choices open to us in portrait representation. Let me explain. And I'm going to be very schematic, but I want to draw out something which is slightly different from simply saying we don't any longer represent people wearing a cuirass, laurel wreath, or toga. To put it very, very schematically indeed, the modern tradition of sculpted portraiture of living sitters was born in the 1450s when Mino da Fiesole sculpted two of Cosimo de' Medici's children, Giovanni and Piero, one in Roman dress on the right and one in modern dress on the left. Modern portraiture, in other words, was born ambidextrous between the ancient and the modern. And for more than 400 years after that, it could be, and often was, an issue of debate about how exactly you should portray a sitter. Should they be portrayed as Roman, or should they be portrayed in contemporary costume? Both options were sometimes ferociously canvassed. It came to a head on various occasions, notably and famously at the end of the 18th century, when the painter Benjamin West was one of the leading spokespersons for the use of modern dress, and Joshua Reynolds against. The arguments are interesting ones on both sides. West argued for realism and against what he saw as the fancy dress of the toga and ancient costume. Reynolds and his colleagues protested against the transience of contemporary fashion and arguing for the timeless quality of Roman costume. In fact, there was a full-scale debate in the Council of the Royal Academy in London in 1795 about whether to have Lord Cornwallis sculpted in modern or ancient dress. Now, Cornwallis had gone on from some rather, to him at least, embarrassing defeats at the Battle of Princeton and the Battle of Yorktown, glorious victories for the Americans. He'd gone on from some very bad defeats to become a slightly more successful Governor-General of British India. And the question was, in what form should he now be portrayed? The ancient side won. It would be, quote, disgusting in 20 years' time, argued one leading sculptor, to dress him in modern dress. It would surely date very quickly. Another argued that it would end up looking absolutely absurd to dress him in modern dress, and it would, besides, prevent the artist from expressing the extent of his ability. And you can find similar debates and ambivalences here in America too. Thomas Jefferson at one minute can praise a modern image of portraiture, and the next he can urge Canova to display George Washington as a Roman general. For American military uniforms, he said, have a very puny effect. Other options could be canvassed too, such as you see in this portrait group of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, not here done up as Romans, but as upstanding Anglo-Saxons. Now, what is important here, it seems to me, is not so much whether the Roman side in these arguments wins or loses, but it's the impossibility of ever ourselves being able to imagine that we could have a debate like that in relation to portraits. You know, a new portrait of any public figure, the one thing we're not going to sit down and say is, would he look better in a toga? Yet, if we stop to reflect, we do have similar arguments, somewhat similar arguments, in other forms of representation, notably theatre, I think, which can help us understand a bit what is going on, what these debates felt like. Imagine a production of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. We know very well enough how arguments can go for and against portraying Shakespeare's play in very different styles of dress. Should it be presented in English Elizabethan costume to capture the style and the idiom of Shakespeare's own time? Should it be presented in the Roman costume of the play's theme? Or would it be interesting to do it in the costume of some modern dictatorship to parade the play's wide contemporary relevance? And we're familiar enough in those debates that we've all had it after we've been to see some wacky bit of Greek tragedy which looks as if it's kind of come from the Balkans or something. We're familiar enough about the arguments about realism, about authenticity, about speaking to a modern audience, about timelessness, that underlie the choices we make for costume in theatre and the arguments that we have about how they come over to us. Now, it seems to me that arguments and debates about idioms of portraiture were not wholly dissimilar to that. They were conducted in the same kind of vehemence, and they were conducted in a very similar vocabulary with very similar terms. It's about things looking absurd or realistic or timeless or relevant or modern. What that helps us to see, I think, is what we have lost here is not so much the Romans. It's not simply that Romans have become impossible to figure modern portraiture. The Romans have been victims of a much bigger loss in modern portraiture practice, namely the capacity to embrace this wider range of representational possibilities that we now reject as some kind of silly, fancy dress. And this helps us, I think, to counter part, at least, only part of the argument about the modern trivialization of the imperial image. I think there's a case to be made for saying that cartoons satirizing, say, a modern politician as Nero or whoever, may not be a trivialization of Rome. They may be the last remaining genre of the modern portrait in which we are allowed to use those wide representational fancy dress possibilities that have disappeared from marble or bronze or oil painting portraits. But of course, there were big political issues too, and again, they're not always the obvious ones. And here I need to raise one final big point that I've skated over before. One of the perennial problems about Rome for its later admirers and imitators was the mismatch between the chronology of its political history and the chronology of its art history. At its simplest, most people admired, and have always admired, the traditions of the quasi-democratic, citizenly Republic of Rome. The problem is that Rome at that period in the Republic produced very few images indeed that could be imitated. The Republic before Julius Caesar assumed sole power might have been honourable and admirable, but the great art, the great architecture, the great schemes of city planning, all those came later under the empire. If you'd gone to visit Rome when it was a virtuous republic, you would have found a ramshackle little town of big town, of local stone, mud brick, unplanned, no great marble columns, and very little art indeed to speak of, and no recognisable iconographic tradition of its own. Okay, there were a few dramatic bronze statues like this one, and there were some warts and all style portraits, but there wasn't much else. It was the Roman Empire under the autocrats that produced all the marble buildings and the vast array of visual images and the overwhelming majority of portraits that were admired and copied and reworked later. The consequences and dilemmas of this are obvious. What it meant was as soon as you dressed yourself up in Roman kit, like it or not, you looked imperial. You couldn't look Republican. There wasn't anything to look Republican. You looked like an emperor. The laurel wreath, the elaborate armour, even that hint of a toga, all signified empire. If you were a radical or a Republican, how could you get around that? How could you be Roman and not be imperial? Well, there were a variety of strategies. One of my favourite versions is that adopted, doesn't he look good? That adopted by the British 18th century, very rich radical Thomas Hollis, who was a supporter of the American Revolution and a great benefactor of Harvard. Now, on the base of this bust, I'll show it you in detail in a minute, you might just be able to glimpse a bit of very faint sculpture here. What it is a pair of daggers and a little hat. Now, the hat is an image of the cap of liberty worn by slaves when they were given their freedom at Rome. And that, plus the daggers, was the very symbol that the murderers of Caesar blazoned on the coins they issued to celebrate Caesar's murder. So for Hollis, even without the trace of a toga, this style of bust was so steeped in imperial power that it needed some revolutionary symbols plastered on it to re-signify it as not pro-empire. Others tried different ways. In fact, there have been a series of attempts in America, as in revolutionary France, to invent a republican iconography that could signal Rome without empire. Rome hasn't given us one, so we can invent it. It's nicely encapsulated here, I think, in Wilson Peel's portrait of Pitt the Younger, another English supporter of America, or in the much more recent Cincinnati sculpture of Cincinnatus. And you see instantly what they're doing. Omit no laurel wreath, no toga, dress them in a short austere little tunic and some tough boots. Now, there is no authentic Roman antecedent for this style of representation at all. As an iconographic scheme, it's an invention designed to get around the dilemma that Roman visual tradition was so very hard to separate from imperial tradition. And that's the dilemma which I suspect lies, just because we've got to have him in, behind Horatio Greenough's infamous statue of George Washington. This is probably the most famous failed statue in the world. And indeed, it's now famous for being a failed statue, as a few minutes eavesdropping at the Museum of American History will quickly confirm. And these kids looking at it here are rather nicely matched by their predecessors 100 years ago. It's a richly documented and richly debated statue, but one thing is very clear. As has often been pointed out, the 5th century statue of Zeus from the Greek sanctuary at Olympia was clearly one of Greenough's models. Greenough, in other words, was trying to exploit another strand of Greco-Roman iconography for Washington, one that did not reek of monarchy. And he managed that all right, but there was a very high price to pay for it. He turned Washington into a god. And that is where we return to Andrew Jackson's sarcophagus, with all the clash between monarchy and republicanism that it represented, and all the issues about remembering and forgetting the Romans that we shall see that it raises. Where we'd left it, was outside the Museum of Arts and Industries in the 1950s. What happened next? Well, by the early 1960s, an enterprising new curator came on the scene, realised that nobody understood what it was doing on the mole. So he gave it the large explanatory label telling the story of Andrew Jackson that you had on your handout in line. That is the 1960s label for the sarcophagus. But sadly, despite this, it wasn't quite enough to keep it centre stage on the mole. And although since then the sarcophagus has had a small fan club, some of whose members I'm delighted to see in the audience today, by the mid-1980s, it was taken off display and it was removed here. This is the vast Smithsonian storage facility at Suitland, Maryland. And the coffin that would have been Andrew Jackson's if he'd said yes, has for the last 25 years resided in Block 28. Now, the good news is it's safe and warm and dry and very carefully looked after. It still has its 1960s label attached to it, And it's easy enough, once you've removed its polythene cover, to get a good look at it. There it is. You can see very clearly, for example, from this bit of its cover, that in fact it's a very, very unfinished sarcophagus. It's not been destroyed, but it has, I think, been very largely forgotten, and it certainly isn't visited. In fact, when I went to see it with Alex Nagel a couple of months ago, we were only the second party of people to come to see it that its very nice custodian could ever recall. And the first one had been Alex Nagel. It reminded me in a strange way of an elderly lady in a care home with no relatives and no visitors, and some very odd company indeed. Because turn round from the sarcophagus, and this is what you see. Well, Block 28 is more or less the transportation department of this storage facility. I don't really know what to make of these images. Part of me, I must admit, finds this weird postmodern juxtaposition rather appealing. I kind of like the idea of the sarcophagus ending up cheek by jowl with the detritus of modern technology and commerce that its original occupants, emperor or not, would never have known. But part of me finds it all a little bit sad. If, as I just said, the Romans were experts in remembering to forget, I can't help feeling that we have done the reverse. This is a wonderfully charismatic object that we have forgotten to remember. So, just to return to Eliot. When Eliot came proudly back with it from Beirut, he hoped not only to reuse it for the president, that was an important aim, but he also felt, quote, an interest, as he himself put it, in introducing among us these ancient relics. And I am confident that they will be appreciated by the antiquarians and learned of our country. Personally, I find myself hoping that Eliot's confidence might be borne out, and that one day this trophy of his might be released from its plastic sheets, and there might be a couple of square yards for it on the Mall again. In some ways, it really is a very ordinary Roman coffin indeed. But the story of pride, of contest, of refusal, of embarrassment, of politics, and of course, shameless, absolutely shameless misidentification sums up very many of the things that these lectures have been about. Thank you.